Daniel Price was a man most people overlooked, the kind of person who blended into the background of life without anyone stopping to notice the quiet strength that kept him going each day. As the janitor of one of the city's largest corporate skyscrapers, his daily routine revolved around mopping endless marble floors, wiping down glass panels that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and emptying trash bins that overflowed with reminders of the luxurious lifestyles of those who worked above him. The executives and staff walked past him in polished shoes and designer suits, rarely acknowledging his presence beyond the occasional muttered complaint about a floor being too slippery or a spill not being cleaned fast enough. To them, Daniel was invisible, a man who existed solely to keep their world spotless. But behind his plain uniform and quiet demeanor lay a story that no one cared enough to ask about, a story of sacrifice, struggle, and a love so deep that it gave him the strength to endure the hardest of days. Daniel had once been a man with dreams. He wanted to become a teacher, to inspire young minds, and to live a life filled with purpose. But dreams had a way of breaking when reality grew too heavy. Years ago, tragedy struck when his wife, Claire, passed away after a long battle with illness, leaving him alone with their son, Ethan, who was only 4 at the time. Daniel had no choice but to push aside his ambitions and take the first stable job he could find, even if it meant scrubbing floors instead of standing at the front of a classroom. His pay was meager, just enough to cover the rent for their small apartment and put food on the table, but it was honest work, and that was what mattered to him most. Each evening, when his shift began, Ethan would sit in the janitor's break room with a sketch pad and crayons, waiting patiently for his father to finish. The boy had a habit of drawing superheroes, complete with capes and shields, and though Daniel often teased him about his colorful imagination, he secretly cherished the fact that his son saw the world through the lens of hope and bravery. In Ethan's eyes, heroes weren't just men in costumes, they were people who never gave up, no matter how hard life became. Daniel often wondered if his son would ever see him as anything more than the tired man who pushed a mop, but he never asked, because in truth, Ethan's smile was all the validation he needed. To the world, Daniel was just a janitor, but to his little boy, he was everything. Still, the weight of responsibility sometimes pressed so heavily on Daniel's shoulders that it felt like he might crumble. Bills piled up, rent was overdue more often than not, and there were days when he skipped meals to make sure Ethan had enough to eat. Yet through it all, he kept going, because giving up was not an option. What Daniel didn't know, as he walked into the towering building that night with his mop and bucket, was that fate was about to test him in a way he had never imagined, not with a broom or a rag in his hands, but with a choice that would place him between life and death, and ultimately prove to everyone that even the most ordinary man could be a hero when it mattered most. The following Friday, after finishing his shift a little earlier than usual, Daniel decided to take Ethan to the nearby park, a place that always brought the boy joy and gave Daniel a chance to breathe away from the suffocating walls of the corporate tower. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the open lawns, where families spread out picnic blankets, children raced each other to the playground, and laughter floated through the crisp air. Ethan tugged on his father's hand eagerly, his small face lighting up as he spotted the pond where ducks often gathered, and Daniel, unable to resist his son's pleading eyes, agreed to let him feed them with a few pieces of bread they had packed. For a moment, everything felt perfect, and Daniel allowed himself to relax, enjoying the simple sight of his son's happiness. But serenity shattered in an instant when the sharp cry of a child pierced the air, followed by frantic screams from onlookers. A little girl, no older than Ethan, had slipped on the wet grass at the edge of the pond and tumbled into the water. Her shrieks turned to choking gasps as she flailed helplessly, her small arms splashing wildly before disappearing beneath the surface. Daniel's heart lurched in his chest, instinct kicking in faster than thought. He shoved his wallet and phone into Ethan's hands, his voice urgent yet steady as he commanded, "Stay here, son, don't move," and then sprinted toward the pond. The crowd around him froze, paralyzed by fear, their panicked shouts blending into the background as he dove into the water without hesitation. The icy shock bit into his skin, but Daniel forced his body forward, his arms cutting through the murky depths as he searched for the girl. For a terrifying moment, he couldn't see her, and dread clawed at him, but then he caught a glimpse of pale fabric sinking deeper into the pond. With every ounce of strength he had, Daniel propelled himself downward, wrapping his arm around the child's trembling body and pulling her upward. She sputtered and coughed as they broke through the surface, clinging desperately to him with wide, terrified eyes. "It's okay, I've got you," Daniel reassured her, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. Kicking hard, he fought his way back to the edge, where trembling hands reached out to help them both onto solid ground. He laid the girl gently on the grass, checking her breathing and rubbing her back as she coughed up water before finally bursting into sobs. Relief swept through Daniel as he whispered soothing words, telling her she was safe now, that nothing would hurt her. The crowd around them erupted in gasps of admiration and praise, people exclaiming how brave he was, but Daniel barely heard them. His focus was on the little girl, who clutched his sleeve as if afraid to let go. It was only when a hushed whisper rippled through the onlookers that he lifted his gaze and realized the weight of what had just happened. "That's Mr. Harrington's daughter," someone murmured, and the word sent a jolt through Daniel's chest. Mr. Harrington, the powerful CEO of the very company where Daniel spent his nights cleaning floors, was not only one of the wealthiest men in the city but also one of the most feared. And now Daniel, the invisible janitor, had just pulled his daughter from the jaws of death. The wail of sirens and the screech of tires shattered the stunned silence that had settled around the pond, and within moments, sleek black cars rolled up, flanked by security guards who moved with precision and urgency. From the largest of the vehicles stepped a tall, imposing man with sharp features and an aura that seemed to command respect even before he spoke, Alexander Harrington, the billionaire CEO whose name carried weight in boardrooms across the city. His presence made the crowd instinctively step back, as though the air itself had grown heavier, but his focus was solely on the trembling girl still clinging to Daniel's sleeve. "Emily," he cried, his usual cold composure breaking into raw desperation as he rushed forward and scooped his daughter into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if to reassure himself that she was truly alive. The girl sobbed into her father's shoulder, her small voice muffled as she whimpered, "Daddy, I almost drowned, but he saved me," and her little hand reached back to point directly at Daniel. For a moment, Alexander's piercing gaze shifted to the soaked janitor kneeling on the grass, his uniform clinging to him, his face still pale from the ordeal. Daniel braced himself for the response he had always known from men like Harrington, dismissal at best, disdain at worst. He expected a curt nod, perhaps even a scolding for daring to touch the CEO's daughter, because in Daniel's world, men like him weren't heroes, they were workers, invisible until something went wrong. But what he saw instead caught him entirely off guard. Alexander's eyes softened, and his voice, usually described in business articles as sharp enough to slice through steel, trembled as he said, "You saved my daughter." There was no arrogance, no commanding authority, just the voice of a father who had nearly lost the most precious part of his life. Daniel, still catching his breath, shook his head modestly and murmured, "I just did what anyone would." But Alexander stepped closer, shaking his head firmly, his grip on Emily tightening as though he might lose her again. "No," he said, his tone carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Everyone froze. Everyone watched. "But you moved. You risked yourself to save her." The crowd, sensing the gravity of the moment, remained hushed, their eyes darting between the billionaire and the janitor who had done what they could not. Daniel's heart pounded, unsure how to respond, but Alexander did not hesitate. "Tell me your name," he demanded, his voice resonant but no longer sharp, more like a plea than an order. "Tell me your name, and tell me what I can do to repay you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt truly seen, not as a janitor, not as a background figure, but as a man who had acted when it mattered most. And as he gave his name, still soaked and trembling, he couldn't shake the disbelief that the most powerful man in the city now stood before him with gratitude in his eyes. The days that followed felt surreal to Daniel, as though he had stepped into a life that didn't belong to him, because instead of returning quietly to his mop and bucket, he found himself summoned to the top floor of Harrington Enterprises, a place he had only ever glimpsed from afar when wheeling his cart through the lobby. The elevator ride alone made his stomach twist, the soft chime of each passing floor reminding him that he was leaving behind the world where he belonged, the service corridors, the supply closets, the dimly lit break rooms, and entering a space reserved for men in expensive suits and polished shoes. When the doors finally slid open, he was greeted not by an assistant or security guard, but by Alexander Harrington himself, standing tall and composed, with Emily happily clutching his hand and beaming at the sight of the man who had saved her. "Mr. Price," the CEO said warmly, extending his hand in a gesture that made Daniel hesitate for a heartbeat before shaking it, his calloused fingers brushing against the grip of a man unaccustomed to physical labor. "Please, come in." The office was vast, filled with glass windows that overlooked the entire city, the kind of view Daniel had never dreamed of seeing up close, but he barely noticed it because his heart pounded with nervous anticipation. Alexander gestured for him to sit and slid a folder across the sleek wooden desk, his voice calm yet firm as he said, "I have been thinking about what you did, and no amount of money could repay the moment you gave me back my daughter, but I want to do more than thank you. I want to give you and your son a chance to live the life you both deserve." Daniel's eyes flicked to the folder, his throat tightening as he saw the words, an offer for a position far above his janitorial duties, complete with a salary and benefits he had never dared to imagine. "Sir, with all due respect," Daniel began carefully, "I don't need charity. I was only doing what anyone would have done." But Alexander leaned forward, his eyes steady and unyielding, and replied, "This is not charity, Mr. Price. This is recognition. You have integrity, courage, and the kind of character this company should value. My daughter calls you her hero, and I agree with her. If this world were fair, men like you would never go unnoticed." For a long moment, Daniel sat frozen, his mind replaying the struggles of the past years, skipped meals, overdue bills, the exhaustion of double shifts, and then Ethan's face flashed before his eyes, the way his son always drew superheroes with capes, calling them protectors of the weak. Maybe, just maybe, Ethan would finally see his father as more than a tired man with a mop. Taking a deep breath, Daniel accepted the folder with trembling hands, his voice thick with emotion as he said, "Thank you, sir." Alexander smiled, a rare softness breaking through his usually steely expression, and Emily ran over to hug Daniel's arm, declaring brightly, "I told you, Daddy, he's a hero." And as Daniel left that towering building later that day, with Ethan waiting outside to throw his arms around him, he knew his life had changed forever, not because of the job or the recognition, but because he had finally learned that even the most ordinary man could be extraordinary when love gave him the strength to act.